The new schoolhouse bell sat in its shipping crate on the porch of the Promise Creek General Store, a bronze giant sleeping in a bed of straw. It was the largest bell anyone in the Wyoming Territory had seen, and it had cost Silas Blackwood a considerable sum. He had also donated the 10 acres of high prairie on which the new clapboard schoolhouse stood, its unpainted pine glowing pale in the fierce summer sun. The town council had been effusive in their gratitude. A school meant permanence. It meant their dusty collection of buildings was becoming a real town, a place where families could put down roots. Silas, however, found their praise as uncomfortable as a new saddle. He had given the land not for them, but for the future, a concept that felt cleaner and more reliable than the people who currently populated the town. He stood across the dusty street, leaning against a hitching post, watching men admire the crated bell. He knew what they were saying. That Silas Blackwood had more money than sense, that his cattle herds were so vast he could afford to throw away a prime parcel of land. They were right about the money, but wrong about the reason. He hadn't thrown anything away. He had made an investment in something he himself had never had, a proper start. His own education had come from the unforgiving calculus of drought, blizzard, and the price of beef in Cheyenne. Therefore, he wanted the children of Promise Creek to learn from books before they had to learn from hardship. The familiar rumble of the weekly freight wagon pulled his attention up the road. It was 3 hours late, its canvas cover bleached and coated in a fine layer of alkali dust. It rolled to a stop in front of the store, and the driver, a man named Miller with a face like a worn boot, climbed down stiffly. Miller exchanged a few words with the store owner, then walked to the back of the wagon. He unfastened the ties and folded back the canvas flap. A hush fell over the men on the porch. Silas straightened from the post, a knot tightening in his gut. The territorial committee in Cheyenne had handled the hiring. They had sent a telegram 3 weeks prior, teacher secured. Arrives Tuesday wagon. Prepare lodgings. B. Smith. Silas and everyone else had pictured a prim woman from back east, perhaps a minister's daughter or a widow seeking respectable employment. The person who emerged from the dim interior of the wagon was not what anyone had imagined. She was a woman, yes, but she was Chinese. She was small and slender, dressed in a simple but well-made dark blue prairie dress, the kind any homesteader's wife might wear. Her black hair was pulled back in a severe, practical knot at the nape of her neck. She moved with a quiet, deliberate grace, her eyes taking in the silent, staring faces of the townsfolk without flinching. She clutched a single, worn carpet bag in her hands. Mr. Gable, the store owner and head of the town council, stepped forward, his face a mask of disbelief. "There must be some mistake," he said, not to the woman, but to the wagon driver. "We were expecting the new school teacher. A Miss Smith." The woman spoke, her voice clear and steady, with an accent that was not Chinese, but the crisp, educated English of a missionary school. "My name is Lin Jing," she said. The committee in Cheyenne uses an anglicized name for their records. It is less confusing on the paperwork. Gable stared at her as if she'd grown a second head. "You are the teacher." "I am," she replied. The simple affirmation hung in the hot, still air, an impossible fact. Martha Gable, the store owner's wife, appeared in the doorway, her arms crossed. "Absolutely not," she declared, her voice carrying across the street to where Silas stood. "We will not have our children taught by a heathen. It's an outrage." A murmur of agreement rippled through the onlookers. The hope represented by the schoolhouse and the bell curdled into suspicion and hostility. Silas felt a familiar, weary anger rise in his chest. He had seen this brand of fear before, on the cattle drives and in the mining camps. It was ignorant and it was dangerous. He had paid for the land, the lumber, the bell. He had made a promise to the territory, and more importantly, to himself. He had built something meant to last. But he was watching it crumble before the first lesson had even been taught. He pushed himself off the hitching post and started across the street, his boot heels sinking into the thick dust. Every eye turned to him, the town's benefactor, the man they all assumed would fix this. Silas stopped a few feet from the wagon, his gaze moving from Gable's flushed face to the calm, composed features of Lin Jing. She met his look directly, and for a moment, he saw not a fragile woman, but a person braced for a fight she had fought many times before. The town waited for him to speak, to side with them, to send her back on the next wagon out. The land grant, Silas said, his voice low but carrying in the sudden silence, was conditional. The condition was a functioning school, with a teacher certified and provided by the Territorial Education Committee. He looked directly at Gable. "She is that teacher." Gable sputtered. "But Blackwood, you can't be serious. Look at her. It's not proper." "Proper wasn't in the agreement," Silas countered, his voice turning to steel. "The agreement was for a school. If you refuse the teacher the committee sends, you are breaking that agreement." He let the words hang for a moment. "And if the agreement is broken, the land reverts to my ownership. The schoolhouse comes down. The bell goes back to the foundry." A collective gasp went through the crowd. The threat was audacious, unthinkable. Tearing down the symbol of their future? Martha Gable's face went pale with fury. "You would do that? You would tear down our school over this person?" "It's not your school yet, Martha," Silas said quietly. "It's just a building on my land. It becomes a school when the children are inside, learning." With the teacher provided, he had laid his stake. He felt the weight of it settle on his shoulders. He was no crusader for justice. He was a man who hated seeing a good piece of work go to waste because of foolishness. Lin Jing had not said a word. She simply watched him, her expression unreadable. Gable, trapped, looked at the faces of his fellow councilmen. They were trapped, too. They could not afford to lose the school. Grudgingly, he nodded. "A probationary period," he announced, as if the idea were his own. "She can stay in the teacher's quarters. We will see how it goes." It was not a welcome, but a stay of execution. As the crowd began to disperse, muttering amongst themselves, a lanky, half-drunk ranch hand named Finch swaggered forward. He had a mean streak that grew with every drink. "Probation," he sneered, looking Lin Jing up and down. "I got a few lessons I could teach her." He reached out and grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into the fabric of her dress. Lin Jing didn't cry out, but her body went rigid. Before anyone could react, Silas moved. He didn't throw a punch. He simply stepped between them and took hold of Finch's wrist. He applied no visible pressure, but his grip was like iron. Finch's eyes widened in pain and surprise, his fingers releasing Lin Jing's arm. "The teacher is here to work for the town, Finch," Silas said, his voice dangerously soft. "That means she is under the town's protection." "My protection." He held Finch's gaze until the man's bravado crumbled. Silas released his wrist, and Finch stumbled back, rubbing the circulation back into his hand before melting into the thinning crowd. Silas turned to Lin Jing. "The teacherage is the small room attached to the back of the schoolhouse," he said, his tone formal again. "I'll have one of my men bring your bag over." He nodded curtly and walked away, not waiting for a reply. He could feel her eyes on his back, but he didn't turn around. As he passed the general store, he heard Martha Gable's parting shot, a whisper to her husband that was meant for him to hear. "He'll regret this." "We'll make sure of it." Silas knew she was right about one thing. Regret was a real possibility. But turning back now was not. A week passed. The heat was relentless, baking the prairie grass to the color of old straw. Silas busied himself with his own work, mending fences and checking on his herds in the high pastures, but his thoughts kept drifting to the pale pine schoolhouse on the hill. He told himself it was about protecting his investment. He told himself it was about the principle of the thing. But he knew it was more than that. He had seen the quiet strength in Lin Jing's eyes, the unbending line of her spine as she faced down a hostile town. He heard the whispers when he rode in for supplies. That she kept to herself. That she was seen scrubbing the schoolhouse floor at dawn and sweeping the porch at dusk. That no one had spoken to her, and she had spoken to no one. Martha Gable had organized the women. No one was to offer help, no one was to make a welcoming call. They would freeze her out. They believed she would break and leave on her own. On the 8th day, Silas found his excuse. The new well pump he'd had installed near the schoolhouse needed its bolts tightened after settling. It was a job for a boy, but he decided to do it himself. He rode his horse, a steady buckskin, up the gentle slope. The schoolhouse was silent. He dismounted, taking a heavy wrench from his saddlebag. As he approached, he saw her through the open doorway. She was not idle. The room was bare, but she had set up 2 planks on crates to make a long table. On it were the donated books, a motley collection of tattered primers and worn-out novels. She sat on a stool, a pot of glue and a needle with heavy thread beside her. She was carefully mending a book's broken spine, her fingers moving with the precision of a surgeon. He stopped in the doorway. He said. She looked up, startled. A flicker of alarm crossed her face before she composed it. Mr. Blackwood came to check on the pump, he said, gesturing with the wrench. The ground settles. I see, she said, and returned her attention to the book. The silence stretched. He could hear the buzzing of a fly against a window pane. He should have just gone to the pump, done his work, and left. Instead, he found himself stepping inside. The air was cooler here, smelling of fresh sawn wood and the faint, papery scent of old books. That's a lot of work, he said, nodding toward the stack of damaged readers. They are no good to the children if they fall apart, she said simply, not looking up. He watched her for a moment, the way she handled the fragile pages with such care. The town, he began, then stopped, unsure how to phrase it. They can be difficult. She finally paused, setting the needle down. She looked at her hands, then up at him. Your towns are no different from your cities, Mr. Blackwood. People fear what they do not understand. Why did you come here? He asked, the question more blunt than he intended. You must have known it would be like this. You could have taught in San Francisco. In a place with more of your own people. A sad, knowing smile touched her lips for an instant. My own people? She asked softly. My father worked 15 years laying track for your railroad. He believed the rails tied the country together, made it one nation. He believed in the promise written in your books, that education was the ladder anyone could climb. She paused, her gaze distant. He died in a rockslide 10 miles east of Cheyenne, building the very line that brings prosperity to this territory. He never learned to read the books he believed in. The air in the room seemed to grow heavy. Silas had a sudden image of the hundreds of Chinese laborers he'd seen over the years, their faces anonymous, their labor taken for granted. He had never once considered their lives, their families, their hopes. She reached into the carpet bag that sat by her stool and took something out. It was a small book, bound in dark, faded silk, its pages soft and worn. The characters on the cover were like intricate brushstrokes. This was his, she said. A book of poetry from his home. He could not read it, but he carried it his whole life. It was the only beautiful thing he owned. She held it out for him to see, but not to touch. I came here because he believed in this place. I came to honor that belief. To be the teacher he never had. Silas looked from the fragile book to her face. He finally understood. This wasn't a job for her. It was a pilgrimage. He felt a profound and unfamiliar sense of shame for his earlier question. He, who had thought himself so different from the narrow-minded townsfolk, had seen her as an outsider, too. A clatter of hooves outside broke the stillness. A man on a lathered horse pulled up, shouting Silas's name. It was one of his ranch hands. Silas! There's trouble. A man named Peterson, the land speculator, is in town with the territorial marshal. He's telling everyone the new teacher brought lung fever from the city, that the whole school is contaminated. Silas felt a cold dread wash over him. This was Martha Gable's plan, but with sharper teeth. Peterson was a vulture who had been circling Silas's property for months, trying to find a way to challenge his water rights. If he could get the school condemned and the land grant nullified, he could file a new claim on the acreage and its spring. He was using the town's fear as his weapon. The marshal would have a warrant. He would have the authority to quarantine the school, to remove Lin Jing. It would be legal, and it would be the end of everything. Silas looked at Lin Jing. Her face was pale, but her eyes were resolute. She had placed her father's book of poetry back in her bag and was standing straight, her hands clasped in front of her. She was waiting for the next blow to fall. He could walk away. He could let the law take its course, let Peterson have the land. It would be a financial loss, but it would save him a world of trouble. The town would be relieved. He could go back to his cattle and his solitude. But then he saw the small, silk-bound book in his mind's eye. He thought of her father, dying in a rockslide for a promise he never got to see fulfilled. He looked at Lin Jing, who had traveled 1,000 miles to honor that promise. Walking away was not an option. "Stay here," he said to her, his voice grim. "Don't talk to anyone." He strode out of the schoolhouse, leaving the wrench on the floor, and swung himself onto his horse. He spurred the buckskin into a gallop, riding hard toward the town, toward the marshal, toward a fight he knew would cost him more than just land. By the time Silas reached the main street, a crowd had gathered again. At its center stood the marshal, a tall man with a weary face, and a portly, well-dressed man with a smug expression, Peterson. "A public health risk," Peterson was saying, his voice projecting for all to hear. "I have a sworn affidavit from a man who traveled on the same wagon, saw her coughing the whole way. It's for the children's safety." The marshal looked uncomfortable. "I have a duty to investigate, Silas." "You have a duty to not be made a fool of by a land shark," Silas retorted, swinging down from his horse. He walked straight up to Peterson. "You have been after my spring for a year. This is your angle? Using this woman to get at my land." "I am a concerned citizen," Peterson said smoothly. "This teacher, a transient of unknown origin, presents a clear danger. The law is on my side." "The law requires proof, not rumors from a hired liar," Silas shot back. He turned to the marshal. "You want to investigate? Fine. I will personally pay for a doctor to come from Cheyenne. A real doctor. He can examine Miss Lin and this entire building. Until he gets here, she is under my protection. On my land. You and your warrant can wait for his report." The offer was a thunderclap. Hiring a doctor from Cheyenne was an enormous expense and would take days, maybe a week. It was a public declaration of his faith in her, a financial and personal guarantee. Peterson's face tightened. He had expected Silas to fold under legal pressure, not to raise the stakes. The marshal considered it. He knew Silas Blackwood's reputation. His word was his bond, and his pockets were deep. "All right, Blackwood," the marshal said, relieved to have a way out of the immediate mess. "We'll do it your way. But this school stays closed, and she stays on this property until the doctor clears it." He looked at Peterson. "And your affidavit had better hold up." Silas had won the battle, but the war was far from over. He had tied his name, his fortune, and his honor to the quiet woman in the schoolhouse. He walked back to his horse, acutely aware that the entire town was watching him, their expressions a mixture of awe and resentment. He had drawn a line in the dust of Promise Creek, and now he had to stand on it. 3 months later, the prairie was painted in the soft golds and browns of early autumn. The air had a crisp edge, and the sky was a deep, cloudless blue. The schoolhouse bell, no longer a silent monument, rang out, its clear, bronze tone rolling across the valley. From the open windows of the school, the sound of children's voices reciting their multiplication tables drifted out, a cheerful, rhythmic chorus. Inside, Lin Jing stood before a class of 22 students. Even Martha Gable's son was there, sitting in the front row, his hand raised with a question. The doctor from Cheyenne had come and gone weeks ago. He had publicly declared Lin Jing to be in perfect health and the schoolhouse to be cleaner than his own office. He'd had harsh words for the malicious gossip that had brought him all this way. Peterson, his scheme exposed and his reputation ruined, had sold his holdings at a loss and left the territory. The town, shamed into silence, had slowly, grudgingly, begun to accept the reality of their new teacher. Her skill, her patience, and her unwavering dedication to their children had done more to win them over than any argument Silas could have made. Silas was a frequent visitor now. He no longer needed the excuse of a faulty pump. He brought fresh venison, sacks of flour, and once, a small pot of wild asters he'd found blooming in a high canyon. He would sit on the porch steps in the late afternoon, listening to the lessons, watching her move among the children with a quiet grace that made his chest ache. Their conversations were simple, about the weather, about a student's progress, about the coming winter. But beneath the plain words, something deep and steady was growing between them. One evening, as the last of the children were heading home, Silas arrived with a small, flat package wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. He found her sweeping the last of the day's dust from the classroom. "I brought you something," he said, holding it out. She took the package, her fingers brushing his. A current passed between them, as real as a lightning strike. She carefully untied the twine and unwrapped the paper. It was a book, bound in dark green leather, its title stamped in gold, Selected Poems of Mr. William Wordsworth. She looked up at him, her eyes shining. "It's beautiful. I thought," he said, his voice a little rough, "that your father's book might like a companion. Something from this place, to sit beside the one from his." She ran a hand over the smooth leather, then looked at the shelf where her few personal belongings sat. Beside her hairbrush and a small tin of tea was the worn, silk-bound book of Chinese poetry. She carefully placed the new book next to it. They looked right together. One from a world of memory and loss, the other a promise of a new world, a new life. She turned back to him, and for the first time, her composure gave way to a smile that was pure, unshielded light. "Thank you, Silas." It was the first time she had used his given name. It sounded more right than he could have imagined. They stood in the quiet of the classroom, the scent of chalk dust and old wood around them. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows from the cottonwoods by the creek. He had started all this to build a future for a town. He had put up a building, bought a bell, donated the land. But standing there, in the quiet company of this woman, he understood. A future wasn't made of lumber and nails. It was made of moments like this. It was built not for a crowd, but for one person. It was the simple, profound act of standing with someone against the world, and in doing so, creating a world of your own. The bell on the schoolhouse was silent now, dark against the twilight sky. But for Silas, its true purpose had just begun. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.